Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn to Jos Ding's Transport and Environment.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Yes, it's indeed a timely and relevant event. Thank you for inviting us on the panel. I'm from Transport and Environment. You briefly introduced us. We are the Federation of Environmental Organizations active in the transport field in Europe. Let me start with an observation that the title of this event, Decarbonized Transport with or Without Biofuels, is rather black-white, and that I would rather say decarbonized transport, probably with some good biofuels. You know, and I hope that we can unite on this area, and then we are already moving to the question. So, what are the good biofuels, and what are the bad ones? So, what is our vision on transport decarbonization and fuel in general, and fuel policy in particular? We need a very strong reduction in energy demand, and in some areas the EU has put successful policies in place. In other areas we are still waiting for such policies, but that's unlikely to be enough to hit the decarbonization targets. We also need to do something about the carbon footprint of our fuels, particularly if we see that the oil that will come to Europe's market in the next decades will not become cleaner, it will only become dirtier as we will exploit ever more unconventional sources. So what is our desire on the fuel side? We would like to see fuels decarbonize. We would like to see honest carbon accounting for fuels, and we would like to see EU policy based on the carbon performance of fuel rather than the name of fuel. Currently we have a name-based fuel policy. In particular, in the transport area, we implicitly stimulate biofuels. We might be moving to, again, a new name-based policy called second-generation biofuel. You should not make that mistake. We should base our policy on the carbon performance on the fuel and not on what the fuel is called. So that means we're not against biofuels as such, but we have big problems with the current biofuels policy of the EU. Both the fact that there's a quantity target out there, but also the way the biofuels policy measures the carbon footprint of biofuels. And it's not a surprise to most of you in this audience probably that our biggest problem is that they leave out the carbon effects of indirect land use change. And that is a highly, highly significant effect. In effect, we have recently issued a study that shows that indirect land use change based on the National Renewable Energy Action Plan data and based on the 4 studies that the Commission has published over the last months, if you put these 2 results in one big model, it shows that actually today's biofuels policy drastically increase greenhouse gas emissions and not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That does again not mean that all biofuels under this policy are bad, but it does mean that the aggregate has a higher carbon footprint than the oil it replaces, and that's the aspect that we find highly problematic about the biofuels policy. We do more things that are bad for the environment. We fly, we eat meat, but the EU is not telling us to fly, the EU is not telling us to eat meat. The EU is telling us to use biofuels, and that's where the key of the problem is. And we need to get this right. If we tell our transport sector to use biofuels, we have an obligation to ensure that those biofuels used are better than the stuff they replace. So the situation is very serious under today's policy framework, and we need quite a drastic change. And what is that change about? The change is actually about exploiting the big potential that there is out there. Everybody, not everybody, many people in this area talk about the vast potential there is to make biofuels in a more sustainable way than we do today. And we do agree, but the problem is that the current policy framework does not reward using this potential. Virtually everything that comes to the EU market meets the sustainability criteria, also those biofuels that clearly, if you do honest carbon accounting, do not pass this threshold. And it's just more convenient. Actually, current biofuels policy steers still far too much on delivering the cheapest liter of biofuel and not the cleanest liter of biofuel. What we need to remediate that is to make our carbon accounting honest, which means including an ILUC factor in our calculations of greenhouse gas emissions of biofuels. And an ILUC factor is not an ILUC penalty. That is a wrong side of spin. It is just trying to make the carbon calculations honest. If we cannot even start honestly calculating what the carbon footprint is of our biofuels, how can we ever have a sensible policy that sorts out the good from the bad? So we need an absolutely feedstock-specific ILUC factor that brings the carbon transparency into the carbon market. And once we have done that, only once we have done that, we can start talking about those biofuels that do not lead to big indirect land use change. And we can today identify certain categories of those fuels: genuine waste, genuine residues could qualify for an exemption. Biofuels demonstrably grown on degraded low-carbon land that doesn't compete with other vital nature or agricultural functions is another category that qualifies. Everybody here agrees that it would be great if we used that land for biofuels, but under the current policy it is just not happening. Farmers make other choices. About the robustness of the science, yes, it is clear that the current scientific results on the magnitude of ILUC still shows some variation, but it's a variation about around highly worrying levels. There's not a single study that says we don't have ILUC or we have negative ILUC. It's all positive. 1 minute, perfect. It's all positive and to very, very positive extra greenhouse gas emissions. So I would really like to make an appeal to the Commission to follow what Keynes said a long time ago, that it is better to be approximately right in calculating the carbon impact of our biofuels than to be perfectly wrong as we are today, and we hope the Commission will act on that principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last of all, I'd like to turn to Jeremy Woods of Imperial College London. We've heard two contrasting views, accounts on biofuels. Can you give us some guidance on how we can make sense of all this? And perhaps as well I know there are a lot of specialists in the room, but maybe you could say a few words exactly about what indirect land use change is, just to make this clear for people who don't follow this in such detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to be here. I work in an institution in the UK, Imperial College London, and inside that I work in the Centre for Environmental Policy. And outside that, I work for an organisation called the Porter Alliance, dedicated to the development of advanced biorenewable systems. Indirect land use change is an extremely challenging issue. We do not yet have good science on indirect land use change, and I was fascinated to hear the divergence of opinions that we've just heard across the panel. It's not actually true that there are no studies that show a negative impact, i.e. a good impact of indirect land use change, as Tom Gunnison was mentioning. And I think the underlying issue here is one of taking comfort in numbers, where the numbers don't yet really reflect the complexity of the situation in the outside world. So stepping back a moment, what is indirect land use change? Well, indirect land use change can be defined by an economic impact where the development of, in this case, biofuels, and it does not have to be biofuels by any means, but in this case, biofuels, causes the displacement of the production of an agricultural, primarily food commodity. That results in an increasing price for that food commodity, generally reflected in an increasing commodity price at the global level or the spot market level. It doesn't have to. And that increasing price causes an expansion of production elsewhere. And that expansion of production elsewhere results in new land being brought into production with a decrease in carbon stocking on that new land being brought in. This chain of causality is actually extremely difficult to define in any way, in any really accurate way. And there's a tendency to adopt highly precise outcomes that don't reflect the lack of accuracy, and we've seen that time and again in the studies that have been talked about here. It also doesn't reflect the time-based component of this interaction between biofuels and other commodity crops, including food crops. And that's that whilst we may be tempted to settle on a specific number produced by historical extrapolation from historical trends, in practice we will see that that outcome, that number, will change over time, and it will change quite dramatically due to things like, for example, the problems with the wheat harvest in Russia recently, the flooding in Pakistan, where you see food commodities start to be challenged by climate change events. And we'll see an increasing volatility in those markets due to climate change, and that makes me wonder fundamentally about this, the introduction of an ILUC factor, because it challenges the expansion of production when we have an increasingly volatile world in terms of those production. I may come back to that later on. I think this issue of indirect land use change, though, is based on more fundamental beliefs, if you like, more fundamental beliefs. The concept of indirect land use change is valid. I was involved in the Gallagher Review in the UK and a number of other studies. This is a highly interconnected world, and these interconnections work in practice. You can see them working in practice in multiple ways. But fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves the question when we develop a policy such as the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe, the Renewable Fuel Standard in the US, and really, to be honest, almost every major country in the world has now developed policies around bioenergy. We need to ask ourselves a fundamental question, and that is the biosphere limited in its capacity to meet new demand? And I think that fundamental question needs to be answered from multiple perspectives, but in fact, the biosphere is not yet limited in its capacity to respond, in its fundamental capacity to respond to new demand. But there's a huge amount of uncertainty around understanding that specific issue. So if that capacity isn't fixed, will new demand result in expanding the total supply of biomass by improving photosynthetic efficiency,